What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Favale coming at you with another 2024-2025 NBA season look ahead, which are way fancier and smancier and more in depth than just regular old previews. We're up to the Atlanta Hawks, which means for the third year running, I'm going to get to speak with Lauren L. Williams of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She does fantastic work over there covering this team. Be sure to follow her on the Twitter machine. That's at Williams Lauren L. Her handle will be up on the screen if you're watching on YouTube, and you can find her stuff. I'll include the links in the podcast and YouTube description as well. We're going to get into all things Atlanta Hawks. I'm really excited to talk about her. I'm recording this before we actually get to chat this time rather than after the fact. Very quickly, if you haven't already, just subscribe already. Apple, Spotify, leave us ratings and reviews. Those help out a ton. I can't stress that enough. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe. Turn on notifications, like and comment on our posts. I will respond when I deem it necessary or / when I have time. But we really do appreciate all the support. These look aheads are a bear, so continue to come out in full force. And if you're new because of these look aheads, stay with us through the season. We cover the entire league, but we try to do things that will allow us to get into each team. We bring on guests throughout the year when we think deep dives are warranted. We do a lot of hard work over here. And I know there's a ton of NBA basketball podcasts in general. It can be tough to stand out. I do think we stand out for how personable we are, but how committed we are to covering this entire league. And of course, just the dynamic between Grant and myself. And I think the look ahead series that Grant and I do, it's unique in the sense that, okay, you want to compare them to team previews. That's fine. I don't know. Maybe you could count them on one hand, people that are previewing the season, looking ahead to the season, let's call it, with this level of detail and commitment that's not behind a paywall. You can count them on one hand, and we are on it. And that's all the kudos, by the way, to our guests who are just fantastic at giving me a ton of time. So, moral of this long-winded story, subscribe to HardwoodKnocks across all platforms and tell people about us if you have not already. And with that, we dive into the 2024-2025 Atlanta Hawks with Lauren L. Williams. Lauren, welcome back. Thank you for year 3. It's the third time you've come back for the Hawks look ahead. How are you doing? How are you feeling? It's a three-peat for this podcast now.
I really love this podcast. It's really interesting to share my perspective on what I've been able to observe of this team, especially now that I've had a couple years of foundation to build off of it. I think a lot has changed over the 3 years, which is crazy to say. Because who would have thought that when we first did this podcast a few years ago, that they'd have a different coach. The Dejounte Murray, Trae Young experiment would have been an abysmal failure, even though the team itself doesn't think of it that way. And the Hawks would somehow have a number 1 pick on their roster. If somebody told me all of that sort of stuff would have happened the first year of this podcast, or at the first time I did this podcast, I probably would have laughed.
They've been, and I was telling you this before we got started, I just did the Clippers look ahead. And in terms of teams that confuse the hell out of me the most, this is like back to back of just absolutely me being confounded. And the Hawks, yeah, you're right. Like the 3-year arc of this team has been, maybe the results really haven't been that different on the court, but like just transactionally and functionally, like there's just so much has changed. They've been, I would say, a violent roller coaster would be the best way to describe it.
With continued mediocre results. But I think we're starting to sort of see maybe the shape of a plan based on just some of the transactions that have happened over the last couple of months, especially since the Dejounte Murray trade. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through the podcast, but, obviously they have Dyson Daniels now, who a long, lanky guard, 6'8", add size to the backcourt. They just drafted a long, lanky, small forward in Zaccharie Risacher. They still have a long, lanky forward in DeAndre Hunter, Jalen Johnson. I think the only, area where you might not necessarily say they have the prototypical size of what has kind of been working in the league as far as bigs is at center, but they still have a guy like Clint Capella, who's 6'10", Onyeka Okongwu, who backs him up, who's 6'9". So they've got some size that they're starting to add in, and I think that was a big key, especially when you look at some of the things Hawks coach Quinn Snyder talked so much about last season, where they struggled and size was just it. So maybe we're starting to see the foundation of a plan, and we'll see how they continue to build on that.
I want to start with the Dejounte Murray trade that I think we all knew I think you and I knew was coming when we talked last offseason. What did you make of the like the overall trade, the decision to do it, and then of
Mhm.
course just the return that they prioritized in those negotiations.
I'm really glad that they decided to finally pull the trigger on it. I think we were all wondering why they didn't do it at the trade deadline, particularly because of the injury to Trae, just how the season was sort of unfolding. It seemed like it was kind of a wash. Like, even if they got to the play-in tournament, it wasn't going to be a long run in the postseason. But I think it was great for him because he's able to raise his value a little bit more and show that he is a good fit for teams out there. And they ended up getting, in my opinion, what I think is a solid return for that. I never anticipated that they would have gotten as many first round picks as they did. They ended up getting 2 out of them. One of them is I think a conditional one. And then obviously you can count a guy like Dyson Daniels as a first round pick because he was only drafted like 2 years ago, 2021 or 3 years ago. So he's still young. I think his ceiling is still, pretty up there. And with a guy like Quinn Snyder and a front office that has Kyle Korver, maybe there's some ways that they can help kind of unlock the tools that maybe the Pelicans seem to be unable to do. So I don't think the return was that bad. I am a little bit confused about why they brought in Cody Zeller. I know he was part of a sign and trade, and that was kind of like a tacked on sort of deal, but it just seemed weird.
It's the new era of the aprons where teams want to
Yeah.
make sure that they're not pigeonholing themselves into, oh, we need to make sure that we're not taking back more money than we're
Hmm.
sending. It was one of those. The Knicks with Shake Milton and Mikal Bridges,
Right.
that whole thing taking time to figure out. Do
True.
you, I thought the return was, I think people probably viewed it against what they gave up to get Dejounte
Yeah.
Murray, which you just couldn't. I did find it interesting though, because I thought that I guess the Dyson Daniels of it all I found interesting. Do you
Hmm.
think like this is someone that they looked at and they viewed like pretty highly in talks? Because it feels like they might have, whether it was from the Pelicans or another team, would have been
Hmm.
able to find a deal that was had more first round equity or was more pick based. But it seems like, just to me, my read on it, based on how the trade unfolded, what they got back was they looked at Dyson Daniels and they treated him as like, this is better than a first round pick for us.
I don't know if it's necessarily better. That's how they viewed it. I think they just looked at it more as it's comparable. Again, he was a first round pick in 2021. Again, he's young. I think one of the big things that they wanted to make sure is that this team got better defensively, especially when you look at where the Hawks kind of ranked in defense last season. They were toward the bottom of the league in almost every category. And so I think in adding a guy who is sort of a defense first guard that they could potentially pair alongside Trae Young, they're not necessarily losing that out when you give up a guy like Dejounte Murray. I think the big thing is with Dyson is just where his offense is and if he can generate enough that could potentially make up for that loss. But I think they see a lot of potential in a guy that is Dyson. He's only 21 years old. And so he's a guy that, if you're looking timeline wise, could potentially pair up with Kobe Bufkin, who at 6'4" can continue to add size to the backcourt. And so I think that it's kind of not necessarily turning the timeline back, but maybe just realigning things in a way that the Dejounte Murray fit with Trae Young may not necessarily have worked because they're only a year apart. And so, you're speeding up the timeline when you add a guy like Dejounte in, and they just kind of weren't there yet. So
What do you think impacted how they went about this offseason more, though? The fact that they won the lottery
yeah.
or that they don't control their next 3 first round picks after that lottery?
It's weird. I think it's a mixture of both. And I think they were just trying to find ways to maximize as much as they could out of not only having the first overall pick this year, but also, potentially recouping some of the picks that they lost in the Dejounte Murray trade over the next, couple of years. There's that hope that they could potentially get that Lakers pick next year. They still have that pick swap with San Antonio. So it's a matter of how good is San Antonio going to be, that maybe they have to actually make that swap because, if San Antonio ends up having the higher pick, they may not want to swap with the Hawks if so I think that sort of thing both of those things, not having total control over their picks over the next few years, and the fact that they were able to get a guy like Zaccharie Risacher, who I think is kind of an underrated first round pick based on some of the highlights that I was able to watch of him and getting to know him, and just how excited this team is about what he can offer. I think the biggest priority was just finding ways to get bigger. And I think they were able to do that, adding some lengthy wings that can be disruptive on the perimeter, and surround that with Trae and people who can still stretch the floor. So I think it seems, at least from what they were able to do, it seems as though maybe they've accomplished their plan. We'll find out about where they stand with that on media day on Monday. So it'll be interesting. I definitely want to see what their perspective is on what they feel they accomplished this offseason.
And so my final question then about the offseason. So you look at those pick commitments. So the pick's going to go to San Antonio on 25 and 27 outright, and then that 26 swap. If they don't have those obligations on the table, do we hear more Trae Young trade noise this past summer, do you think?
No, because I kind of think his contract makes things a little bit more complicated. I think there would have to be a lot more shuffling as far as what maybe they were going to get back in return, and whether teams had the space in their books to make that possible. I mean, he's making $43 million over the next few seasons, and he has a player option, I believe, in the last year of his contract, which I think is 3 years from now.
Yeah, it's for that 26-27 season. So he's got 2 full years left before the player option.
So it's, as good as Trae Young is, I do think that his size still kind of makes teams a little bit hesitant, especially with how much the league is putting a priority on size over the last few seasons, especially in the backcourt. You look at Luka, 6'8", Anthony Edwards was 6'4", 6'5". So I don't know. It's definitely a tough situation, but I think just all of the things that Trae has been able to do, how much offense he's been able to generate for this team, how much of a face he's become for the team, the city. People do go to the games for him. So I definitely think that puts a value on the Hawks keeping him around a little bit longer, unless things change in a way that he no longer wants to be here.
So with Trae Young, we had this discussion last year when I was going through the questions that I'd ask you about whether he's become underrated. And I actually think it's definitively that he is underrated now. I don't know, you can levy the same criticisms against him, but you already mentioned it. Like, this is a tentpole offensive player. Do you how much though? I guess I don't want to use the word blame, but how much was he? Do you think he gets a raw deal when people say that his play style can't be shifted? Because I do think you look at the way that they did play with Dejounte Murray. It wasn't perfect at times, and I would still like to see Trae Young cutting more off ball, running off more screens. But he's also you look at the percentage of his shots that came off assists, those upticked substantially over the past 2 years. And we have seen him, there are even moments last year, Trae Young to me is the type of player who can he be Steph Curry? No, I don't think he's probably going to be strong enough or even big enough for that. But he can fly around off the ball, and we've kind of seen it. Do you think he gets a raw deal when people just assume that? The biggest knock against him, honestly, to me now, aside, people focus on the defense, but it almost feels more frequently people are saying his play style is just intractable. And I think I've reached the point where maybe we haven't seen it in practice yet, but I also feel like we've seen enough flickers of it to say that's not true.
I agree. I definitely agree with you that he flies around the court. He has the speed for it. I think with playmakers on the team like Jalen Johnson, things are sort of unlocking a little bit more, where you have a point forward, if you will. And maybe with Zaccharie Risacher, that also opens things up. Another playmaker that can take some of the pressure off of Trae to create for others. And so I definitely think that part of his game is underrated. And I think, the partnership that he'll have with Quinn Snyder will for sure continue unlocking that. I think, we only just started to see Quinn's system sort of implemented last year, because if you think about it, Quinn came in February of 2023. There's not a lot of time for him to implement his
Mhm.
systems take a time, or take some time to build. And so they're heading into the second year of the, I would like to say, Quinn Snyder era. It's not that I don't count that sort of half season that he had, but because he was just sort of getting to know the team, it's hard to call it the Quinn Snyder era at that point. So I kind of say that, this is the second year of it. And, he's still working with a lot of young players. I mean, the average age of the Hawks is 24. And
Wow.
yeah. And so Bogey and Clint, Larry Nance, they tip the scales a little bit, but a lot of their biggest contributors are like 27 and under. DeAndre Hunter is sort of that older of the bigger contributors, outside of the three guys that I mentioned who are over the age of 30, which I know it's like weird with us to say that, oh my gosh, over 30 is so old, but obviously we know in the grand scheme of the NBA, over 30 is practically ancient. But
Yeah, the amount of time. I mean, I'm a hypocrite in other areas, but I'm sitting here like, oh, that dude's turning 33. And it's like,
right,
he's still 2 years younger than you, man. And you're calling him old.
exactly. Like I'm the same age as Bogey, and I'm like, Bogey,
Yeah.
you're an old guy, dude. You're an old man.
We're putting him out to pasture because once they turn 30, they just get chipped. Or what is
Pretty
it? Chip them
much.
off on like a block of ice. It's like out to sea. Like,
It's like,
bye,
it
turn
was nice
30.
knowing you. Thank you
Yeah.
for your services. But yeah, I mean, you look at sort of the guys that I mentioned again, Dyson Daniels, who is sort of the guy that you're expecting to be the starting two beside Trae, 21. Zaccharie Risacher, again, it's debatable. I still haven't convinced myself that Quinn Snyder is gonna pick the 19-year-old small forward over the 27-year-old veteran that he has on the team to start out the season. I think things can change, but Zach's only 19. He literally just turned 19 in April. So it's very hard for me to see that he'll be the starter, but I still think he'll contribute greatly. You look at Trae Young, just turned 26. Jalen Johnson just turned 22. Onyeka Okongwu just turned, I think, 23 or 24. So again, it's a very young group of guys, and I've sort of lost the point of the question that you were asking, but I do think that yes, there is. I got it now. There is room for Trae to sort of move off the ball a little bit more, especially as a guy like Jalen Johnson, who's going into his fourth year in the league, has a little bit more experience, understands the speed of the game a lot more after how much he played last year, can open things up, take some pressure off of him as the primary ball handler.
Do you notice, did anything go into, we saw Trae Young's rim frequency and his free throw attempt rate was still great, but it was not up to what Trae Young has been doing. Did you notice anything different or that specifically went into that dropping?
Yeah, it just seemed like he wasn't getting a lot of calls. I think there is something to be said about his early career and sort of gaming the system a little bit in his favor. And maybe I think there's been a shift of maybe officials kind of swinging to the other side of the pendulum, and they're not sort of, baiting or taking the bait on some of those moves that used to generate calls for him in the past. So I think that's sort of what it is, because he definitely looked to attack. He looked to go downhill. He looked to, try to fight through contact. But I think, again, I think it just swung to the other end of the pendulum. But what can you do?
Yeah, I'm like, when I see these things now, I just attribute it to, oh, okay, the NBA like kind of even admitted that they shifted the way that things were being called. But he kind of even had a downtick before then, and he was also absent a lot of the time after they really made that shift as well. Because that was the first time he's dealt with like a serious injury, right, in his career, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember another one.
I think the only big one that you can really point to is Eastern Conference Finals, when he sprained his ankle over the ref's foot out of bounds.
Okay, yeah.
And he was trying to, I think he tried to play through it, or he might have missed some time. But yeah, those are the only two that really come to mind of major injuries to him.
Aside from anything we've talked about, what is the biggest storyline for this team that you'll be monitoring throughout next season?
Yeah, I think there are there are a lot of storylines with
Yeah.
this team. um, Obviously, it's how does Zaccharie Risacher adjust to the NBA? Um, is he able to sort of have the type of success that he was able to have at JL Borg in the EuroLeague? Is he able to kind of use his high basketball IQ to make some of the cuts to the basket that kind of drew the attention of a lot of scouts in the pre-draft process? Is he able to knock shots down from three? Can he stretch the floor? Is he able to add some strength to him? Because he is kind of I used the word lanky before. He is very lanky. He's definitely got a teenager's body. And so how he's able to do that, I'd love to see, the rise of Kobe Bufkin. He was injured a lot last season, missed a lot of his rookie year. So it would be interesting to see how he fits into the rotation, because when you look at sort of the projected, it's Trae, Dyson, DeAndre, Jalen, Clint as your starting five. It's likely going to be either Bogdan Bogdanovic, or Onyeka Okongwu as the first off the bench. Probably go with Bogey, just so that you have that sort of minute or so for Trae to kind of sit about midway through the first quarter, and then he usually comes back toward the end, and then the other guard sits down. I kind of project Kobe would kind of be the backup point guard in that sort of rotation. It's just a
God, I
matter
was so
of,
high on him.
right?
Yeah.
Because they want to see the ball in his hands a bit more. And so that's kind of how I anticipate things going. Obviously, you have to have Zaccharie Risacher in there, but I would say he's probably like top 8, top 9 in the rotation. And then the next storyline is, of course, Clint, and he's on the final year of his contract. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more, but like, do we finally see the rise of Onyeka Okongwu as, the guy who is the heir apparent for, should the Hawks decide not to re-sign Clint, which is very hard for me to see them doing, just because, again, we touched on it before, he's on the other side of 30, which is usually not a great thing for free agent centers. And so he has sort of been a guy that has taken slow starts to the season, and then it's like post All-Star break, he kind of like breaks out a little bit more, and then you see the old Clint that a lot of people were so used to seeing in Houston, and they're like, oh yeah, you really should be a starting center. You really earned that spot there. So I think those are the three big things. Obviously, how does Trae Young adjust to the new rotation? And if he, again, like we touched on, is he able to move off the ball a little bit more? And then, of course, how does the defense fare? Because that's just something that's not synonymous with the Hawks. It's in fact, it's like usually not the first thing you think about when it comes to the Hawks. So I think they've gotten better defensively just based on the pieces that they've added. But I'd love to see how the reality stacks up to what's on paper.
Latching on to the Zaccharie Risacher of it all. So it does sound like we'll know more as you go through the media days and the training camps, but it sounds like your expectation would be that they're going to bring him, at least in the beginning of the season, along a little bit more slowly, that he's not necessarily going to be baptized by fire.
It's just really hard for me to see that, because based on everything that we saw last season with Quinn Snyder's rotations, and then in addition to his experience with Utah, it's a very, very rare that he gives a significant amount of minutes to his young players. Maybe early in his tenure in Utah, things might have been different, obviously, with Rudy and Donovan Mitchell and that sort of core. But it's just really hard for me to see them going that direction, especially because they have a guy like DeAndre Hunter, who, yes, we know typically does better coming off of the bench, but he's also making, on
$20 million or whatever.
Exactly. He's like making $21 million a season. So it's just hard for me to see them, justifying a bench player making that sort of money. But yeah, I I think Quinn very much prioritizes development, and I think the Hawks would want to put Zach in the best position possible, and potentially bringing him off the bench is the sort of route that I see them going.
Where do you think, as a rookie, he can have the biggest impact on this team?
Honestly, I think his biggest impact will probably be shooting and defensively. I know that's so cliche, but
I
I
will
think
say rookies have gotten better defensively, it seems
Mhm.
like. And I don't know if when you were covering Summer League, there was I can't remember which game it was, but he gave an
Mhm.
interview afterwards and he he harped on his defense
Yep.
afterwards. And I'm like,
He was like, I didn't play nearly as well defensively as I wanted to. Yeah, it was like the first game.
I was like, that kid fucking gets it. And that made
Yes.
me just a little bit more excited for him than I had been, like, just because. And I was probably been like by osmosis polluted by these people just saying like, oh, he's not going to be a star. He's not going to be a star. Like the people who've watched more college than I have.
Yeah.
But to have someone focus on their defense like that, it made me excited to be like, especially perimeter guys when they're rookies.
Mhm.
I'm just like, whatever. But
Mhm.
I'm very interested to see if would that be a way for him to carve out, like if
More
he's having a
playing time?
consistent impact. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one of the big things that Quinn Snyder sort of values, particularly with young players. Again, it seems so cliche, but if they can make an impact on the defensive end, then they truly do earn more minutes. We sort of saw that with a guy like Kobe Bufkin last season when he was healthy and he could play. He had some really great minutes against Kyrie Irving when the Hawks played Dallas in March this past year. And then you look at a guy like Krecji, you look at a guy like Garrison Mathews when the Hawks were going through so many injuries and they had to go sort of toward the end of the bench. Those guys really did earn minutes because of how well they were playing defensively. And so for Zach, because he is a guy that can be super versatile, he can guard some of the bigger point guards, shooting guards, as well as, the guys at the three. Maybe if it's a slower four, I could see him maybe
Mhm.
having some success. But because of his size and length and his reach and his ability to disrupt things with that and his awareness of things, I think he can have some success defensively as he gets used to the speed of the game. And if he's able to knock shots down, heck yeah, he's going to earn some minutes. So I definitely think that's sort of how the competition over the course of the year might go if you're trying to make a case between him and DeAndre Hunter. If it's just he's playing better defense than Dre, then
Mhm.
maybe then you start to wonder, well, why isn't he starting yet if, Snyder's still going with a usual lineup. But yeah, I think the biggest way he can make an impact is defensively and, of course, shooting.
One of the not knocks, but I guess forms of skepticism with him, people have wondered, is he going to be able to create on the ball or do enough on the ball? One, have you, like, from what you've seen of him, do you think that there's more there to explore? And
Mhm.
two, and I think this is the more important question, how does this team even tap into that to try and develop that when you're also juggling? Okay, it's not just we have Trae Young, but
Mhm.
until they act otherwise, like this is a team that's kind of functioning on a semi-immediate timeline. So how do you kind of juggle this? And it might speak to his overarching role in this
Mhm.
team. How do you juggle the development of the number one pick? Like this isn't just someone you drafted at the back end of the lottery, but
Yeah.
number one pick with people can make their jokes about the Hawks, but they are trying to win basketball games right now.
Oh, for sure. I think the thing is development has been something that they've harped on wanting to do. Especially at the start of last season, you could kind of see it not just with some of the young guys and like the Kobe Buffkins and the Mo Gays who were still able to have some growth even though they were dealing with injuries. Their two-way guy, Seth Lundy, he was able to have some progress. I mean, he spent most of the time in the G League, but he was doing well enough in the G League that when they had that initial injury to Jalen Johnson, they brought him up with the rest of the team and had him play. And so I think there is definitely room for that growth. I think, there's no better guy like Quinn Snyder to kind of help with
Mhm.
that sort of thing, especially if they're bringing him off the bench. You see it all the time when Quinn is coaching. As soon as somebody comes off the court, he's going to talk to them almost immediately and he's explaining things and then they sort of go on their way. So I think the staff is very committed to that sort of thing. And so it's definitely going to be a journey, but I think in terms of his development on the ball, I was pretty impressed with some of the self created shots that he was able to make. And on top of that, he found some pretty great looks for his teammates at Summer League. Some of them didn't go down, but he has such good court vision that he can find some really cool passes behind the back. I don't think he's going to nutmeg a guy, but he has some moves to him that I think, especially as he's playing with some of these more elite players and not just a summer league roster, that we can probably see some fancy moves. And obviously with Trae, there's going to have to be a balance with that. But if we're talking about them developing some of Trae's off the ball skills, putting the ball in the hands of your rookie, or even again, a guy like Jalen Johnson, is probably the way that you want to do it and experiment, especially at the beginning of the season. Obviously, as the season progresses and they see where they are in the standings, things might change and they might buckle down on some of the things that were working and experiment less. But I definitely think at the beginning of the season, we might see a few more experimental things happening, especially with putting the ball in the hands of someone other than Trae. Again, you have Dyson Daniels as well, who can create shots. And so I think the thing that Quinn Snyder's systems are predicated on is ball movement, and being able to have as many guys who can create is ideal for that. And so I just named 3 others other than Trae Young who can do that. We haven't even mentioned Bogey yet.
And
so that's 4.
That was interesting too, because they also have Dyson Daniels, who just really right now can't score outside of floater range consistently. How do you anticipating them using him on offense? Is this someone who will get a crack at kind of those backup point guard reps then?
Yeah, I think we'll probably see a rotation. Not probably. I think that we might see a rotation sort of similar to last season, in that Dyson kind of employs the role of the Dejounte Murray, that when Trae goes to the bench, he shifts to the 1, Bogey shifts to the 2 when he comes onto the court. But then you can also play them a little bit interchangeably, because Bogey did play predominantly the 1 in the Olympics. And so I think that this team has added guys who have a lot more versatility in their offensive game. Maybe Dyson, in terms of shooting frequency and accuracy, may not necessarily have a ton of versatility, but he can still pass the ball.
Yeah, he is really, I'm obsessed with him because he has really good feel.
Yeah.
And like the floater is like, it goes in for like a good amount of the time, and he's suffocating defensively. It's just, I guess if you're going to generate more off-ball movement and you have the shooting, like he's someone who I guess could benefit from playing off of Young. But I look at him as maybe the guy, and you already mentioned it, if you're going to stagger Trae Young from someone or separate their minutes a lot, it feels like Dyson Daniels might be the guy to do that
for sure, because I think Bogey is a guy that would benefit so much from a guy who has such solid court vision as Dyson Daniels. Being able to turn and look for those kickouts, I think that's one of the big things that the Hawks needed a little bit more of, is just finding Bogey. I think, let me look, I have to double check, but as far as Bogey, he shot the ball really well to start the season last year. And as his usage went up with the injuries, it kind of was a lot less accurate. And so if they're able to play guys like Dyson and Zach, even DeAndre, Jalen, if Onyeka can hit threes a bit more consistently, because he was knocking a few down on some of the attempts that he made, he just has to be a lot more efficient with it. They have quite a few options that they won't need to play Bogey nearly as many minutes as they did last year. I mean, he averaged 30.4, which is a career high. And he's the type of guy that sort of benefits from playing about 25 minutes or less. So, so long as they stay healthy, maybe Dyson gets a little bit more efficient with his outside shooting. Zach, starts off maybe not necessarily the best, but he grows into his role quickly. They won't have to play Bogey as long, but Bogey will benefit from a guy like Dyson, Zaccharie, who make these on time, on target passes. And he is such a quick trigger that those are the type of guys that you want. But definitely Dyson. I think I've always been impressed with his basketball IQ and, like you said, his feel for the game. So it'll be interesting to see how he's able to work with a shooter like Bogey and how much the Hawks can take advantage of that.
Now, you mentioned all those names, and it makes me wonder, like, who among these three, who they made contributions at different points of the season last year, and Vic Krecji was just kind of a revelation. But between Vic Krecji and Kobe Bufkin and Garrison Mathews, like, one or two of those dudes is probably going to fall by the wayside when you kind of look at how this rotation is shaking out. So do you have any, like, what would be your expectations for, and you mentioned that they still kind of view Kobe Bufkin as important and as someone who would, he's 6'4", build out of the draft is, oh, he gets to and finishes at the rim. He can play off the ball and he defends his butt off. It's kind of like, well, like that feels like the guy that needs to get reps, but is he going to be the best of those three? You don't necessarily know. It's like, how, like, what is the push and pull there going to be? And if you had to guess, like, which one or two of them is going to maybe suffer the most in terms of their minutes played based off, again, all those other names that we've just talked about?
I definitely think Vic Krecji and Garrison Mathews will probably suffer from, you know, the influx of versatility that they added into the rotation. But I think of the two of those guys that I mentioned, Veet might end up inching out Garrison a little bit more, again, because of size. 6'8", has a great feel for the game. And so because of that length and size, he's a bigger body that you can inject at the 1, 2, or 3. So I think Garrison probably suffers the most. Then I would say Veet is sort of the next one that would probably fall to the wayside. But definitely I see Kobe kind of being inserted into the lineup, particularly if Quinn plays 8 to 9 guys. Well, particularly if he plays 9 guys.
What do you, or I'll frame it this way, what should we believe in more from what we saw of Vic Krecji last year? Is it the fact that the 3-pointers were going in, or the body of work that he delivered defensively, where it's, oh, he's just like held his own against Jason Tatum? That's just like, as you, and he's 6'8" too. I feel like when people talk about Vic Krecji and even stand out, it's, no, the dude is big.
I forget sometimes how tall Vic Krecji is, and then I stand beside him and I'm like, oh, you're a very large human being, especially because he is such a baby face. Nicest dude, just one of the, I can't say enough great things about V, and I think he's the guy that would benefit the more minutes he gets to play. And we saw that as the season went on, or as, you know, those 13 games that he started went on. And, you know, the Hawks valued him enough to convert him from that 2-way at the end of last year to a standard contract this year. So
yeah, but not in time for the play-in.
Not in time for the plan, but I think we could clearly say that. See, they had,
but it ended up working. They got the number. Yeah, that's a good point.
They got the number exactly. So I definitely think that he's somebody that they value, especially because of his size. But also, again, he is a little bit underrated defensively, but I think he still has so much room to grow. He's still young. I think people forget that he's only like 22, 23. So, you know, the ceiling is still there. I mean, he has a good body of work. I was surprised that OKC, you know, didn't factor him into their larger plans after, you know, the 2021-22 season. So hopefully he's that diamond for the Hawks. I think he has it all. He can shoot. He can pass the ball. He's solid defensively.
I think that's what I trust too more, by the way, is I trust
his
the
shooting
defense or the defense over the shooting. I need to see more of that. And the passing is interesting because, and I did go back and watch more of him in preparation of this podcast. He feels like I want to see him get minutes on this team when they have more of the ball handlers out there, because I don't trust him to do that. Like, there was just too many turnovers when they were having him run pick and rolls. It wasn't great, but it feels like he could be a very good, like, connective passer. And
absolutely.
And so, like, if you can get him in the right lineups, that's why I'm hoping. I think of the three, I'm highest on Kobe Bufkin long-term maybe, but I think I still want to see the most of Vic Krecji right now.
I think he is an exciting player and he has some flash to him. I don't know if you remember that like that play that he sort of rescued, that it's still burned in my mind. Except I forgot who they were playing against, but it was like he initially passed into Capella, and the pass got bobbled or something, and then he picked it up and saved the turnover and like hit it behind the back and then went to the hoop. And it was just like, if he could do more of that stuff, like that's, to me, it's like justification for him getting some more minutes.
Yeah,
Do you know what I'm talking about?
It was like a wraparound at the was it against the Pelicans?
It might have.
I think was it. I can't remember, but I think it was like I remember the kind of the broken play, and then it was like almost a wraparound pass, but directly at the basket, which you don't necessarily see. Yeah,
and he ended up making the layup, so it didn't end up being like a full wraparound pass. It's like he wrapped it around himself, and then.
Oh no, I think I'm thinking of a different play.
Okay,
yeah, because he didn't score on the play that I'm thinking of. Someone else did.
It's just I think he's a diamond in the rough, and I want him to get more minutes because I really do think the more he plays, the more he develops, and then the better he just gets. So it's a win-win for everybody, isn't it?
What were when he was healthy and from what limited time we saw him, what were kind of just your biggest takeaways or impressions of Kobe Bufkin's game?
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit already with the defense he played as a rookie. Again, you don't always see that sort of, what's the word, dedication to that side of the game. But he was, and I hate to use the cliche, he was locked in. He was a big body. He was disruptive. I just want to see him be a lot more efficient in terms of his shooting. And then obviously just making a few better decisions, but that's only going to come with time. He's still really young. He just turned 21. Yeah, he just turned 21. So I just want to see him be a little bit of a better decision maker. I think he can pass the ball, but I think there are times when he's creating his own shots. It's like you could see him still thinking in slow motion a little bit, where it's like, okay, I'm going to shoot now, and it gives obviously defense time to recover and contest the shots, or I'm going to go inside, and there's just like that split second where it's like, okay, go up for it, but he doesn't, and it allows people to collapse the paint. Or so it's just making more quick, decisive reads for himself, not just as he's passing the ball, because I thought he made some solid decisions when he was creating for other people.
Jalen Johnson may have won Most Improved Player last year if he hadn't gotten hurt enough games. Yeah. What stood out the most to you about how he played last season? And then what's kind of one area of development you're still going to be monitoring this year?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'll probably monitor most is just how can he stay healthy? Because sometimes when he plays, it's like he's just going full force. There's only one speed when it comes to Jalen Johnson, which is great, except when you're rolling your ankle 2 or 3 times toward the end of the season when the Hawks really need you. But no, I do think that motor is really what generates so much energy for this team, because the Hawks really were at their best when he was playing. I think they started the season 6-4 in their first 10 games. And then it's like, after he went down, they lost the next 14, not the next 14, but the majority of the next 14. I can't remember the exact number. I think they were like 4-10 or something like that. So he is sort of the X factor in that team, just because we talk about his size, but just because he could get them out in transition so quickly, it really changes the speed, the pace of their game. Because sometimes when you look, somebody gets a rebound and he's already gone after steal, gone, and he's just very splashy. I mean, you can't think of Jalen Johnson and not think of his dunk on Austin Reeves, him catching 2 bodies on, I think it was Josh Hart and Isaiah Hartenstein. He dunked on Chet. So I think he wants to dunk on Victor. I don't think he's gotten to play the Spurs because he's been hurt, or maybe he played the Spurs when they came to Atlanta on Martin Luther King Day. But yeah, so I mean, he's just always looking to catch bodies, and that's what's going to fill the seats. People love seeing dunks. People love seeing explosive plays, and he's going to deliver on that. And I think the other thing that I think will really entice people to him is if he can shoot the ball more efficiently. We saw a little bit of that in stretches, but there are just some games he's shooting it really well, and then some games it's just not great. So if he can consistently knock those shots down, he for sure is going to be in the conversation again for most improved.
You mentioned the dunks. He's definitely someone who has a list of people he wants to dunk on. I know players are asked, and then they have to. I was like, no, that thing is framed and laminated and is hanging up in his locker. Yeah,
I think one of the OKC broadcasts when he dunked on Chet, after the dunk, because it's showing the slow motion replay and him running away, and you can see him talking to bench like, I told y'all I was gonna dunk on that, and I won't say what he said, but he definitely knows who he wants to get.
I think one of the things that stood out to most to me for him is because you mentioned the stuff in transition, and he can play at such full throttle. I don't know if I appreciated what his ceiling could be when things slowed down and offensively he was still able to make plays. What I really don't have a feel for, and I'm wondering if you have a better insight into this, what is he defensively?
Honestly, I would like to think of him as a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. I mean, he's got the length, he's got great court awareness, he's very disruptive. He averaged like 1 point something steals last year. So he can get in those pockets and be pretty disruptive against other people. 1.2, which was like the third, tied for the third most on the team per game. And so I think just because he's able to get in to people, take up space, and just really be a pest on the ball, he's great. And then on top of that, off the ball, again, that court awareness, just being able to keep a constant eye on where the ball is. He can cut off people driving to the baskets, slow down some of those blow-bys. So I definitely think he's got a lot of tools in his belt, and I think it's only made better based on who he's sort of surrounded by. And in all honesty, I think he's at his best when he's surrounded by Clint and DeAndre. So it'll be interesting to see how, having a rookie beside him who's a little less tested might be. He does great with Onyeka Okongwu because they're boys. So they have a really great chemistry that they're just perfect in sync together. So again, it'll be interesting to see with some of these new players and how, having a guy like Dyson Daniels in the rotation makes his life easier and just helps him take up more space.
Should we, or would you expect him to get an extension, or do you think the combination of the Hawks are a very, cost conscious team on top of the fact that last year was his first full season playing a bunch of minutes and he still kind of finished it hurt? Is this more likely then to leak out until restricted free agency?
No, I think he's a guy that they prioritize. I think they were invested in his development, especially in sending him to the G League, which he embraced fully. And the fact that I think he's sort of on target as far as his development. I mean, he was taken 20 in the draft. What was it, 2021? So it'll be, again, they're going to be in an interesting position because they have him, they have Dyson to also think about, and then they also have to start considering guys like Kobe or Zach, just getting their ducks in a row as far as who they're planning on sort of resigning. But I definitely think he's a top priority for them. And I think, the number we'll see is going to be sort of commensurate with what he deserves, particularly because of how much value he had for that team last year. I mean, they just were not as good without him.
Yeah, I'm wondering if just because they could, in theory, be somewhat flexible next summer, if they try to do the thing where they want to work with his smaller cap hold and don't extend him. I think regardless of when he gets paid, his deal is going to, I think some people are going to get sticker shock from his deal. Kind of what we saw with when Devin Vassell signed his extension with the Spurs. Because I'm still not sure. I mean, I'm not even sure I fully realize how good he is. And so I think people that aren't necessarily watching the Hawks every day or following them don't understand like how good, especially on offense. I think a lot of people view him as just this kind of like quaint play finisher. And last year specifically, he just showed like so much more than that. And so if you told me that he gets, I don't know, I don't think he'll get, I'll be shocked if he gets the max for sure. But if you told me it's like
I don't think you get the max.
30 or 30, I mean, if you're him and you look at what you did last year, I know you finished third, you saw the money that Emmanuel quickly got. I know it's different positions, but 30 plus million feels like it
I was
might
gonna
be.
say I could see 27 to 30, 31, 32. That wouldn't shock me.
That feels about right.
Yeah, like he'll be okay.
Yeah. So what's going on up front? You've already mentioned Clint Capella. This is now, you even expect, it sounds like, Capella to continue to start, which I think makes sense because this team it's big with its perimeter players, but you look at just, okay, if you want to get into the center of it all, I mean, Larry Nance Jr. is good. Onyeka Okongwu is good. They're undersized for actual bigs. And then, of course, you have Clint Capella. Like, what is the plan here, both short and long term, for them up front?
That's the biggest mystery to me, honestly. But I do think that, one, because they've obviously already extended Onyeka Okongwu, he is sort of their center of the future. It's hard for me to see Clint Capella coming back. I could see them potentially drafting a center, in 2025, especially when you look at some of the guys that they were looking at in this year's draft. You had Sarr, you had Klingon, two really big centers. And of course, if they're lucky again and somehow get the number 1 pick, especially if they're able to get that Sacramento pick, or
I don't even think they can't feasibly, I guess the Lakers pick that they have is not protected. I don't need to, because their own pick is headed to San Antonio.
Their own pick is head into San Antonio. I think Sacramento is protected 1 through 12. 1 through 12.
Oh yeah, the Lakers one is unprotected, so they need the Lakers to just be absolutely awful. There you go.
I mean, hey, there is a world in which Sacramento could be really good and somehow do really well in the West. There is a world.
I think that pick will convey. I think that they'll probably end up with 2 first-round picks next year, would be my prediction.
And if they can somehow magically end up with 1 again.
They need the Lakers to be really bad. They need LeBron to request the trade to Golden State that everyone's been waiting for, and that's their pathway to it.
Who knows? But I do think that, they could potentially draft a center, and, maybe they sign one of the many that are available in free agency next year. So yeah, let's see who's available. What centers? Yeah, there are a lot of centers. I mean, maybe is there a Rudy Gobert reunion with Quinn in Atlanta? Oh, I do not foresee that happening at all. Like, I just don't. But yeah, there are quite a few centers who are unrestricted free agents next summer that, or even if they go into restricted free agency, they could totally kind of compete for. So who knows? Maybe we'll see them bring Bruno Fernando back. He seems to return every 1 to 2 years.
The boomerang.
We love Bruno over here. We love Bruno Fernando. So yeah, maybe we see them, sign some guys in free agency. But yeah, I definitely foresee, to go back to the original point, Onyeka Okongwu is just sort of the guy of the future. Last year, we saw him play a lot more minutes coming off of the bench. Sometimes we ended up just seeing him closing out those games. And so that, to me, says that they're developing him to eventually sort of slide into that starting role when Clint's no longer with the Hawks.
Is there any concern about, because they were not a great defensive rebounding team last year, and they were pretty good when Clint Capella's on the court, but you look at Onyeka Okongwu, who's 6'9", is there any concern about if you view him as like kind of your long-term center or big of the future in the middle? I mean, you're going to run into the same issue even with Larry Nance. So when you're getting into those secondary lineups or just certain lineups, like, is there anything they can do to like buoy the defensive rebounding when you are playing quote unquote a little bit smaller at your center spot? Is there certain lineups that make it like, oh, Onyeka Okongwu should really play with like these 1 or 2 guys?
I definitely think I touched on it again. I think he definitely thrives beside Jalen Johnson. Again, he's another guy that attacks getting those sort of defensive rebounds. Maybe we see a guy like Zaccharie Risacher sort of step up a little bit more, and that's a way that he earns minutes on the floor. Dyson is a great rebounder as a guard, so that's another reason I think they prioritized bringing him into the rotation. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard, especially when you're going up against the Sixers, the Knicks, Milwaukee. I'm trying to think of obviously Denver. Charlotte, they've struggled against Charlotte, but there's a world where they can do pretty well. We know that a team like Miami isn't the best at offensive rebounding, and so that's sort of where they can maybe thrive and make up some of that ground. But yeah, it's really hard for me to see or envision a lineup that's going to really knock it out of the park, to mix sports metaphors, in terms of, out rebounding a team on the defensive end.
And again, they could address down the line. Just I'm kind of fascinated to see if you
that's really fascinating now that I think about it. I think definitely
it's interesting because so many people, and I understand why. It's Onyeka Okongwu is just like he's the center of the future, and it's like, well, then you're going to run into this issue. It seems like a lot of the time. So I'll be curious to see. I mean, they do have wings, I guess, who you can hope to get. Like Bogey can rebound some, but just like of the new wings, like can you count on Dyson Daniels or Zaccharie Risacher to provide those bumps there?
When you look at cleaning the glass, Dyson was pretty up there, I thought, with field goal, the defensive rebounding percentage.
And I mean, those might be two that you could explore playing together. And especially if Okongwu is going to be taking more threes this year, so that you're not as worried about the floor spacing there.
It's in the 85th percentile for defensive rebounding.
The 95th, is that what you said?
85th.
Oh, wait, that's higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I was just looking at this the other day. So I was thinking, so now that you mention it, I definitely think, trying to, again, it's similar with, insulating Trae with as much size in the backcourt. I think it's a similar thing of just trying to insulate Onyeka with as much size on the outside to help in some of those battles, especially like you said, if he's taking some of those threes, he can draw the center out a little bit more, and maybe that opens up some things for other guys to box out guys and they can get rebounds. Who knows?
So what is, and I mean, this might tie into the rebounding discussion we just had a little bit, but when you're looking at their defense overall, what is your, I guess, where do you think that they are now built to improve the most defensively with the roster maneuvering following?
For sure on the wing, because of just how much they sort of added guys in. Again, I talk about those lengthy guys. That's somewhere that they struggle. And again, that sort of helps out a guy like DeAndre Hunter, who's often tasked with defending your DeMar DeRozans or defending, I'm trying to think who else I've remembered him historically really being a Kawhi.
They've all, just because of his body type, he's needed to defend these guys that he probably has no business defending.
But now that they've added in, again, a guy like Dyson Daniels, he has a lot more help, hopefully, if he can stay healthy, from Jalen Johnson. I really do think that's sort of where they bolstered that. That's where they struggled a lot, is sort of on the perimeter and slowing guys down and just making sure that they don't have, I think with Dyson and Jalen, they'll sort of help with some of those blow-bys and allow DeAndre maybe some time to recover and get to guys and maybe stop them, or give Clint some time to get into a position to maybe block the shot or something like that. So that's sort of what I envision is sort of the improvement of where they've really gotten better defensively. I think what I'm interested to see is how they handle transition defense, because that was just awful last year.
Yeah, if they play it, I think that will be the improvement, is if they play transition defense. There's like the
the bar is so low.
But everything you actually outlined now, not to be, that was me being an asshole.
Yeah.
With sincerity, though, just like when you look at the personnel that you've just gone through and broke down, like if you have Dyson Daniels, if you even Vit Krecji, Zaccharie Risacher, we know at least we'll get back. But I think the Hawks, like Achilles heel over the past few years, if you watch them, after misses, it's like, why are so
Mhm.
many guys out of frames at the other end when the other team's in transition? And now it feels like they might just have more guys who will be back on
Mhm.
defense, which is, you know,
Half the battle.
it's low hanging fruit, but it's
Yeah.
gobble it up. And I think their
Right.
defense could probably improve by like a few spots for sure.
I agree. I definitely think that's sort of the big thing is just, are they able to get back? And so we'll definitely be watching it. And maybe it'll end up being the same old Hawks. We'll see.
Are you ready to enter the cookie cutter portion of the podcast?
Always. I love cookies.
Okay, so looking at the roster today,
Yeah.
before seeing any games, what do you bill as their biggest need?
We talked about it, just a bigger center. And as somebody who really does like Onyeka Okongwu, I think that's just, when I had anticipated that they would have added more size to the lineup, that's sort of what I would have wanted. Like, I was really intrigued by the idea of Sar and Klingon, just because you can never have too many 7-footers in your lineup.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're definitely going to have a challenge at the 5, but maybe that's the part of the plan, is to go out and draft a 7-footer. I'll have to double check who's in the class of 2025 for
That, or
that.
they
But
just want like between six, they'll be Trae Young and then just a bunch of dudes between 6'6" and 6'9", and that's how they're gonna
pretty
play.
much, I mean, that seems to be the plan. But I don't know. It's just like the way that the league is going. The fact that, 2 7-footers, 3 7-footers went in the top, like 10 in the last 3 drafts. It's just like the league is just getting bigger, and especially at the 5. And so you just can never, in my opinion, pass up that opportunity. But we'll see. I like Zach. I think he'll do great. So I still think I would still love to see them potentially get somebody a little bit bigger at the 5. But I think for now, it just seems like Onyeka's the guy that they have pegged as their center for the future.
There, and you just said something that made me think of this, and I can't remember who said it. So if they're listening to this, I apologize for cribbing it from them. But we've all known that, like you mentioned, that the league seems to be gravitating towards size, and I totally agree. It feels like size with skill, whereas you don't necessarily want the Clint Capellas of the world as much anymore, that are more limited, kind of on both ends of the floor, and what they're going to, they'll be great at what they're great at, but the stuff they're not.
Versatility is key in this league.
But, and this is the comment I'm cribbing from someone mentioned, it used to be just so easy to chalk it up to, well, you'll just find a big who can play, it'll be cheap, and you figure it out after the fact.
You definitely need mobile 5s.
And now you can't just find one. Like, and now that I'm really just thinking about it, it's like, oh, you can fill that at the minimum. And that's gotten a lot harder to do, is to find like impact centers that can play actual minutes on the cheap, or even in general, I guess, at this point, if you're viewing it through a postseason lens.
Yeah, it's obviously, I think, Kristaps Porzingis really, really shifted, I feel like, how people look at the 5. I mean, he was drafted in 2014. Obviously, the injuries didn't help his case, but he's made quite an impact, especially over the last 3-4 years, being in Washington, now with Boston, and just how much of an impact he made on that series in those first 2 games that he played. I really think that set the Celtics up for success. I mean, yeah, the Celtics is just a powerhouse with him on the team. I mean, I'm not saying that it's an easy feat to beat the Celtics without him, but they're definitely a more beatable team if they don't have him in the lineup.
I don't know. They barely had him in the playoffs last year, and they still just ran through everybody.
I guess it depends on matchup, but you're looking at, if we go back to then Dallas and looking at just like what Derek Lively was able to do, and then they also have Daniel Gafford, it's just, they've got twin towers. You look at Cleveland, Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, they're still trying to figure out how to work the 2 of them in the lineups. But I mean, the twin towers are seriously, in my opinion, makes life so much tougher on the Hawks anytime they play Cleveland. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's just the thing that I see, is that they need somebody who just kind of tips the scales a little bit in terms of size and mobility in the front court.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about, or something about this team that flies under the radar? Strength, another weakness, a storyline, development, a player, whatever, that you think deserves more shine?
I honestly think I'm just so surprised at how little attention Risacher has gotten as a number 1 pick.
Okay.
I guess I understand where people are coming from, where he was sort of a guy that they were like, is he a number 1 pick? I'm not sure. But you just think about some of the players that have been former number 1 picks and the attention that they sort of had, after the draft happened, and sort of the excitement that they tried to build up of these guys as the season sort of progressed. And I just haven't really sort of seen that. So I don't know if it's just because he's in Atlanta and Atlanta's no man's land. But I think that's the big thing that's just kind of shocked me, because you would think that he'd be somebody that would be in the running for Rookie of the Year, right?
I mean, no, I guess the team that he's on, no, because I don't think the opportunity is going to be there.
Fair.
But when you're a number 1 pick, yes, the assumption is this is so unique because the Hawks are this team that was mediocre and got the number 1 pick.
Yeah.
You never really see that. But yeah, I get
that's
what you're
why
saying.
I guess I'm like, why isn't it should be talked about a little bit more, especially because of the fact that they had only a 3% chance to win the number 1 pick. I mean, like, I don't know. That just seems maybe this is my bias because I cover them.
Well, and honestly, what I think is kind of underrated is, and it involves Risacher, is they just won the number 1 pick. They just traded Dejounte Murray for what I think, even with Dyson Daniels, was a future focused return. Like Dyson Daniels is still a prospect. You got 2 first-round picks, and we're sitting here. They don't control their next 3 first-round picks.
Yeah.
Like, what is Atlanta's direction?
Yeah.
Like, what is the long-term end game here? And I don't know
am
if that's
surprised
receiving
that's not talked about. I am surprised it's not talked about more nationally. I mean, you hear it here and there, but whenever I talk to people from other teams or scouts or anything like that, I mean, I had a scout that told me, he's like, I can't even figure out what their plan is last year. And he's like, I haven't even really heard conversations about what their potential plan is. So it's interesting. They're just not a team that people talk about.
And it's any decision they make is going to be probably overly scrutinized, because if you said, hey, let's reset, well, unless you're getting your own draft picks back, why are you doing that? But then if you turn around and let's say they use the Lakers pick, they use the additional first-round pick they get, they use someone and they go out and make an upgrade, you're not good enough to do that. What are you doing? And so
exactly,
I don't think they can necessarily win the press conference, I'll call it, no matter what direction they do. But it's also just, as of right now, they still feel like they might exist around the middle. And I don't know what, over the next 3 years, while those picks are conveying to San Antonio, I don't necessarily know what the right pathway. It's probably just that Risacher pops. Like there's, because I think for them, the incentive right now is you can't be bad. It doesn't make sense when you don't control your own picks. And so you kind of hope that Jalen Johnson continues to progress. You hit on some of these other additions, but it's fascinating to me that they're not trapped because they have options, they have talent, but I have no idea where they're going. I just have none.
It's funny because Howard Beck, he put out his sort of tiers of, where teams are, and if you can figure out kind of where their decision making is leading them, and or if you can like realistically see that X decision is going to help them win a championship or at least put them in contention. The Hawks are just literally sort of in his no man's land territory, and that nobody can figure them out. And I think the key is just that they've added, I think the big storyline is just how much size that they've added around Trae, especially either in the backcourt or on the wing. I think that's just the biggest thing, and we have to see how it plays out. It'll be interesting for sure, but I think the big thing too is just, what do they do with Onyeka? And if he truly is this, is this his season to really prove that he's the center of the future, even though it's clear that he's sort of positioned as that? Has he fully earned it? I don't know. I think that I'm still out on that.
I think that's fair. You've mentioned this earlier, I think at the top of the podcast, about who might be starting. The top 10 rotation for this team at full strength, is it kind of just like when you look at the names of who would be the top 10 set in stone? Because you have Trae, you have Bogey, Risacher has to play, Jalen Johnson, Capella, Hunter, Okongwu, Jalen Johnson I already mentioned. So I would have Larry Nance Jr. So that's 9 locks.
Yeah.
Who do you think would be the 10th person to kind of round that out?
Did you say Kobe?
I did not.
Yeah. So if I were amending that list, I would probably put Dyson over Bogey just because, he would set them sort of on the right path defensively, hopefully, and you can sort of inject Bogey in for more shooting when they need a little bit more offense. I would probably, and we touched on this, throughout the show, but I'd probably start Hunter over Zaccharie, just because, again, veteran, a little bit more experience. He's making $21 million a year. And then you go from there. I think, you put Zach in a position of success to give him a chance to truly adjust to the speed of the NBA. I don't think he necessarily needs a lot of time, but I do think trial by fire may not necessarily be the best. I mean, he's obviously played with professionals already, having played in Europe, but obviously both games are just different.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe he's not necessarily coming off the bench a long time, but if the season were starting tomorrow, that would kind of be how I would set up the sort of rotation, with Kobe being number 10.
While this can be to some extent matchup dependent, what do you think winds up being their go-to crunch time unit?
The go-to crunch time unit, I think Trae. I think potentially Bogey. Again, shooting. You want to put your best shooters on the floor. I'm still so I think it just depends on how quickly Zach adjusts to the NBA, because it could be either him or DeAndre.
Mm-hmm.
I lean a little bit more heavily towards DeAndre. Again, the veteran, used to the speed of the NBA, has been there before.
Yeah.
Can go off on random nights. But if Zach's the guy who's just adjusted quickly, he's more consistent. His defense is consistent. I could very well see a possibility of Quinn turning to him, particularly because number 1 pick. And then Jalen, probably Onyeka, because they've kind of scaled back on Clint's minutes when Onyeka's healthy.
Actually, this might be one of the teams where we see a lot of just shape shifting in crunch time. Now that when you're going through it, I'm kind of looking at it, they're probably going to use a bunch of different lineups.
I mean, I could see that very well, but I also think that Quinn Snyder was a very, very much a creature of habit last season, and some of the crunch time lineups were pretty consistent.
Oh, so maybe it's like a post trade deadline thing where it's if they're already out of the race or something. That's when they get experimental. That would make sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there a weirdo or funky lineup that you think that Quinn Snyder should roll out next year?
Funky lineup. Well, if we're going with the 10, I honestly wouldn't mind a world where we see Dyson. Well, I guess maybe you want to line up with Trae in it, right? So I guess Trae.
It's your funky lineup. Whoever you want can be in it.
Funky lineup. Okay, maybe this is like the funkiest of funky.
I already love it.
Dyson, Bogey, Jalen, Onyeka, and Clint.
Ooh, okay, wow.
That's a big lineup.
Jalen, Clint, and we're talking about their lack of size, up front sometimes. It's Jalen, Clint, and Onyeka will take it. That's huge.
That's a big lineup. That's funky.
I would like to see, and this isn't an indictment of Trae Young.
Yeah.
I just throw in Dyson Daniels, then give me Risacher, Jalen Johnson, Vit Krecji, and then I guess I should probably say DeAndre Hunter, but I'll probably go with Bogey for the extra off the dribble creation. Let's just put those basically. Yeah, okay. There's 2 guards technically in there, but you're really all just like a bunch of wings and power wings.
Yeah.
So let me see that.
Now that's funky. I
Because I
could
guess so.
see,
Jalen Johnson's basically your 5 in that
yeah,
scenario, and you're gonna have
and he's
Krecji and
played
Reese.
minutes at
Yeah,
that. He's played
yeah.
minutes at the 5. Um, that's funny. The only way I see that is if Onyeka or Clint are hurt, and Larry Nance is hurt.
Oh yeah, they got Larry Nance Jr. is probably going to be hurt at some point if we know anything about Larry Nance Jr. Maybe they're all in foul trouble. I don't want to wish injury
Foul
upon
trouble.
anyone.
Foul
Yeah.
trouble. That's a good one. Yeah. Okay, because Onyeka does have a little trouble with fouling. He's still kind of he was still figuring out a bunch last year. And Clint sometimes just gets called for some random weirdo ones that you're just kind of like, what? It usually happens when like people are boxing him out and they've got an elbow in his face and the ref doesn't see that and he like pushes up. Yeah, it's weird. But all right.
I'm gonna root for it.
I wouldn't be surprised if I honestly wouldn't be surprised if I saw that. If all your 5s were in foul trouble.
I mean, you could throw. I want like the 5 outlook. So Larry Nance Jr. can be in there, and then I guess you remove Bogey or Dyson Daniels. I'd probably just remove Bogey because I feel like the defense then of those 5 with Jalen Johnson, Nance, Krecji, Risacher, and
might
Daniels.
not have a lot of scoring.
Dyson Daniels will just run point and hit a bunch of floaters, and that's the plan.
And Jalen just dunks in transition every 5 seconds.
And Vic Krecji commits a turnover every 3rd possession trying to run. So that'll be, as we record this, they're over under, Lauren, is set at 35.5. Would you take and I'm pretty sure it was when we did this last year, it was like 36.5. So it's right around the same.
And I think they won 37 last year.
Yeah. So are you taking the over or the under on that 35.5?
I'd probably take the over by like 1 or 2.
That's pretty on brand for this team.
No, I mean, maybe I'll be a little bit, maybe I could see them getting to 38.
Honestly, this is the team, but I think I said this last year too. It just wouldn't shock me if they blew everyone's expectations out of the water. And this might be that I was staring at this roster and then I was talking about it to you for the last like 70 plus minutes. And that I've talked myself into being higher on it. Like maybe I'm 2 or 3 years in front of.
I've made a convincing argument.
Yeah, you were so convincing, but I just look at it and they have a lot of, and I've harped on this previously, they have a lot of lineup optionality right now. And I think it's more than they've had in quite some time. And so if everyone's healthy and things break right with some of the wild cards, I think specifically if Risacher is good right away, I'm not saying he needs to be great, but just good. That could be a game changer for them.
Oh, absolutely. Honestly, I think my ceiling for them, if I'm being overly optimistic, and I mean overly optimistic, I could see them sneaking in to the top, like very like last second sneak in, like maybe that last game of the season as a 6th seed. But in reality, I think their ceiling is a 7 seed, still playing team.
I think that's fair because the 6, I know it never breaks like we think, but you have the Knicks, the Sixers, the Celtics, the Bucks, the Cavs, and I like the Magic and Pacers and Heat are kind of in this. I'm lower on Miami than most, but so that's 8 teams right there.
Yeah.
If you ask me who I think of those teams the Hawks could realistically be better than, I think probably like 2 or 3 of them is fair to say that it could happen. I don't know if I would predict it.
I mean, I can see them being better than Miami.
Yeah, for sure.
Because like you, I'm not super high on Miami, especially how things shook out last year. I could see them, depending on how things shake out, they could be solid over. Why am I blanking on Orlando? They've just had such a hard time with the Pacers, and I think with Pascal, I think that's where I get a little bit nervous about them being confident that I could say that they could beat them. So if anything, I could see the Pacers being maybe that final 5 or 6 of the East. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, they're clearly, I think some people want to loop them probably into the same like Charlotte. I think they're clearly better than Charlotte, Washington, Detroit, Chicago. The question marks to me would be, can you be better than 1 to 2 or all 3 of Indiana, Orlando, or Miami? Like those are kind of the 3 teams that I think the Hawks could be on or better than their level, but I could also easily, of the teams that I just named, they might also have the lowest floor of that group of 4.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think the thing is, again, if they're very healthy, not very healthy, if they remain healthy, I think they're a very competitive roster. And I think they're more competitive than maybe people are giving them credit for. But it's very hard for me to see them cracking into the top 6 unless, they make a crazy run because injuries just ravaged the East.
Well, between Milwaukee, New York, and Philadelphia, injuries, and even Porzingis isn't going to play until 2025, I don't think. So maybe the door will be open.
Yeah, but maybe not necessarily Philly, but I don't know. I guess Milwaukee and New York just seem to have enough depth that they can still sort of hang around. And Jalen Brunson is just Jalen Brunson. He's a monster.
Yeah. Like it can't be Giannis, it can't be Jalen Brunson. And actually, Philly is probably better built to navigate Joel's absence. But if you told me, though, that the Hawks were like 17th in defense, I might just be like, you know what? They did finish with a top 6 spot. Like they don't need to be good.
Yeah.
They don't need to be league average.
They just need to be more serviceable.
If they're better than we suck.
Yeah.
Like if they're better than awful, that's when they get super interesting to me, because I think just as long as you have Trae Young, even if it's not always the cleanest look, even if there are some problematic lineups, you can have a good offense for extended, a great offense for extended.
And you can always count on Trae either finding Bogey, finding Clint to finish at the rim, and then obviously if Jalen is healthy, you can always count on Trae finding him in transition.
You can honestly count on Trae finding it. Like he's the best, like in terms of generating assists at the rim and from 3. Like he's just one of the best in the business at doing it. That might fly under the radar at this point. People dismiss it.
Mean, he was what, 20 and 10 last year?
That's just, I mean, like he's
25.
He's kind of been around the same, like 20. Like what is he, 25 and 10 every year? And we just kind of like, oh, but that's not good enough or something. So I will be fascinated if this team is good to see if they're willing to make upgrades on the, like if they're there, but they're not quite, but if they're 7th at the trade deadline, like, is this a team that buys or do they stand pat? And I think that's something I'll be looking at, because again, it comes back to those, we're going to bookend this and finish where we started. It's how do they view themselves because of those draft obligations to say.
And then I'm also curious though, like if they're 7th at the trade deadline though, who's going? Who did they trade?
Well, I think what's interesting about them is they have a lot of digestible contracts, but I do view this, and it's not necessarily an insult to these players, but I think that you could move Larry Nance Jr., Clint Capella, or DeAndre Hunter and just really not feel the ramifications that you normally would if you're trading rotation player X.
I think actually, now that you mention it, I think DeAndre and Clint, especially since we talk so much about Onyeka being sort of the center of the future. If he and Zach are just killing it, starting off the season just way better than anybody ever imagined, I think that could give them the confidence to pull the trigger and maybe have a couple of upgrades here and there.
And look, Capella specifically being expiring, if they're willing to attach anything to him, like that's a real offer for something. I don't know what the Hawks might be targeting another big man in that trade.
Yeah.
But Lauren, is there anyone about this team I haven't asked you about that you think needs to be touched upon before I let you skid out?
Mo Gueye.
Let's do it.
Mo Gueye. We touched on him a little bit because obviously he was I mentioned him being among like the injuries with Kobe, that just their rookie season was sort of stunted a little bit because of that. And he's one of those like kind of periphery guys that I don't think he'll get necessarily a lot of playing time, but I think that if he can, maybe they'll send him to College Park for a little bit, and just depending on how things shake out with this season, because things are just, the only constant in the NBA is that it's unpredictable. He could find himself making a case to maybe be in the lineup. And I think there's somebody that they're high on, that they want to play the wing, but he can also play minutes as a 5 because he played that predominantly in college at Washington. Is it Washington or Washington State? I think it's Washington.
He went to, I'm looking at his page, he went to Washington State.
Oh, Washington State. Yeah. So yeah, he's kind of one of those guys that it's like, I think he's on the periphery of like the top 10. He's like maybe number 11.
Ooh, I did not. Like, that's a deep cut. I love it. Now I'm gonna have
Yeah.
to go back and watch more of him. So
If you watch
so
that,
trade Jalen Johnson, trade Clint, trade Onyeka, and build around Mo. Is that what that's what we're trade Trae?
Yeah, definitely. See, if I'm a GM, that would cost me my job. He's good. He's good. And I think he has a high ceiling, but he's just still so raw because he hasn't been playing that long. And especially if they're developing him as a wing, they need a little bit more time. But I would definitely, if you're going back to watch anything, watch that last game that they had against Indiana at the end of the season. He went off for like 19 points and was just like, bucket. So he just didn't. I think the thing that surprised me about him a little bit is that you didn't necessarily, and maybe it's just the type of talent that was around him, but at Summer League, you expected him to sort of take a step forward, and he just didn't quite do that. So I'm just wondering if that's an indictment of who he's surrounded by and he sort of plays up to who he's playing with, or if it's just he needs more time.
He is the tall. Well, I guess Cody Zeller is 6'11" too, but he's one of the two tallest players on the team. So if we want size in there you go.
Maybe that's one of the wacky lineups. Throw him in there with like Onyeka, Jalen. Just throw all five lineup.
Lauren, this was great as always. Are you able just to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do?
Absolutely. You guys can find me at ajc.com/sports/Hawks or something like that. Or if you are somebody who's on the Twitter machine, X, whatever you want to call it these days.
Twitter, please. I beg you.
I just don't want to get sued.
Get sued? Oh, God.
We don't know how Elon will react if you keep calling it Twitter too consistently, but you can find me on Twitter at WilliamsLaurenL.
Thank you so much for your time as always. For anyone listening, you can find the links to where you can find Lauren's work as well as her Twitter handle, _Twitter forever, in our podcast and YouTube description. Thank you so much for giving me so much time as usual. And as you know by now, I will be pestering you again down the line.
Looking forward to it.